Excellent. Okay, thanks a lot. So yes, it's a pleasure to be here today. And as has just been introduced, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the demography and society modules. This is work package 5 within locomotion. Um, so I'm at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. Just to briefly present what it is we do. So we're a United Nations think tank. I think maybe within the United Nations we're sort of well known, but outside some people haven't heard of us. So essentially, our job is to do research in line with what is needed within the United Nations and of course for the member states of the United Nations. So our vision is a world where people are safe from environmental risks and prosper in harmony with nature. And the mission is knowledge for a sustainable world. We unite science, policy, and practice. So according to all this, our role in the project is to really kind of forward the societal perspective and consider how people are impacted by the transition now and projections through the future. So I'll just highlight that I'm not a modeler and my presentation isn't going to be very technical about the model as such. It's more about the approach and the ideas that we've tried to incorporate as we've put together these modules. So I'll just talk about the kind of context and approach behind, as I've mentioned, the ethos of really forwarding society within the project. And then I'll talk a little bit about the demography module, and then a little bit more about the society module. I'll just pick out a couple of elements which might be of interest, and then a few conclusions. And then, as noted, Guilherme will talk a little bit about inequality, going into a bit more detail towards the end. Okay, so just for a little bit of context, when we were starting off in the project within the team of people working in the work package most closely, also with, especially with the University of Valladolid and University of Pisa, we conducted a bit of a review, and the idea was within WILIAM, within locomotion, to better represent society within models, within integrated assessment models, but within models more generally. Our scoping review showed that actually there are a couple of problems with the way that people, humanity, society are represented within models. So firstly, it was quite common that where society is represented, what it actually means is population. So there wasn't really an in-depth study of what is happening to people. And of course, people aren't one monolithic entity. There's various aspects of characteristics and qualities of populations, and this is the combined to form societies. And the other aspect we found is that quite often population, or if it might be called society, actually within a model is part of the economy. However, this isn't in line with what I suppose some economists would say this, some economists wouldn't. If you come from a kind of ecological economics perspective, and in fact, the way that the Sustainable Development Goals are set out and apparently, hopefully implemented, we can see that the economy is actually a subset of society. So the economy only exists because people and humans are interacting and allocating resources. Maybe with artificial intelligence, society will be less important, but for now, the economy is within, what happened there? The economy is within society. And both of these are actually occurring within the environment or the biosphere. So this is the wedding cake diagram on the left. This is the way that the Sustainable Development Goals are conceptualized. But then on the right, this is a nice little scoping review we did that showed that population is a relatively small module within most models relative to economy and energy. Okay, so with this in mind, what is it that we're actually trying to do in these twin modules? We're basically trying to forward the position of humans. So by humans, demography, and society. And we have a threefold approach to this. So as I mentioned, if humans are represented within IAMs, sometimes not always, but it might just be population. But if we have a better developed population and endogenous population, we can do more with it, and we can actually speak about demography as opposed to just population. Demography is a richer term than population. And then this other perhaps problem that populations can be treated as a monolithic element. Rather, they have one characteristic, one shared characteristics. However, if we have a separate module looking at society, then we can consider the issues, the global risks that we're facing through the transition, but also the opportunities as well. So if we have a combination of a better developed population, therefore demography, and we have a new module looking at society, then we're kind of on an equal footing with the other modules, and we can enlarge this population circle relative to economy and energy. This is the idea. Then the third, I suppose, related idea is that models can be divorced from reality. So I think as I said, I'm not a modeler, and I'm aware of the fact that you need to kind of balance what is objectively true and possible to model, but also to try and understand what it is that we should be modeling for stakeholders. And also stakeholders might have different ideas about the interrelationship between elements within a system. So the third aspect was to develop priorities, understandings in a participatory manner. So there's an element of participatory modeling here also. So I'll just go on to the last of those first of all. So as part of this, we did a little bit of fuzzy cognitive modeling. So this was a way of doing some participatory modeling. And because this was a couple of years ago during the peak of COVID, this was actually an online session. And it was only with 8 stakeholders, but it's still quite a rich, intensive session for a few hours that we conducted. Through this session, we're looking at a couple of research questions. So first of all, what are the main issues and risks to society in the transition to sustainability? So that was just eliciting, taking ideas from the participants. And then related to that, what are the interlinkages between the main issues and risks? And yeah, I think this challenge is what I mentioned. It was very much the team's perspective that whilst we want to get on board these ideas, these perspectives, these priorities of stakeholders. So we had stakeholders from working in the European Commission, working in global development agencies, working within the United Nations, to try and get what they think are the issues of the day or the issues of the future. However, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to match that up with what could be classed as objective science about what can be modeled and the natural links between systems as well. So this is our attempt to bring together these two somehow competing elements. So on that, what we find within society and demography, probably a little bit more than some of the other modules, is the idea of what's possible and practical to model. So here we have this, I think you've probably seen the diagram, I haven't labeled it before, but within this we have certain ideas that are much more easy to model within planetary boundaries, and then the donut economy, which emerges from it really. So if you look towards, in the center, we have the social foundation, and these elements, I think they're agreed upon, maybe the main issues that are of importance within social development. right at the top, energy, water, food, health. I think there's, basic needs essentially. But then it becomes a little bit more complicated and a little bit more difficult to incorporate a model as we go down the list. So education, income, and work, Inyaki's talked a bit about these, for example, but then peace and justice and political voice, we had the idea, and this was raised, that these would be very important to model, but how do we do this? And as I noted here, it's a little bit difficult if we're talking about links and feedbacks, and then these feedbacks are, feeding into the rest of the model. We need to be really certain about our data. So the data has to be meaningful, reliable, and available. And for some of these, this just really wasn't the case. And then also we have to come up with a plan to model them if there isn't already data within them. So we need to model the components and their relationships. So this is just by way of saying that, yes, we want participation. Yes, we want opinions for what is possible to model. And we had this specific interaction. There are other interactions that weren't specifically focused on this. But I think it's a challenge for modelers to meet these two goals of bringing in ideas, but also doing what's practicable. Okay, so just very briefly, through the process of fuzzy cognitive modeling, we used a program called LUPI, which is online, and it means that people can simply put together what looks like a causal loop diagram, very user-friendly. With just 5 or 10 minutes training, they're able to do something that sort of makes sense. And after we elicited the risks and we ranked the risks, we then made thematic models individually. So this is a thematic fuzzy cognitive model for well-being. So these are people explaining how everything interacts and the pluses and minuses, the sort of interaction that occurs. So this is quite a basic model, and it can A, inform discussions, and B, we hope inform the model. Later, what's a bit more interesting is that we put these together into a composite model. So part of our team actually took together the mini models which have been produced by the participants, and we came up with a composite model. Of course, there's a little bit of project team involvement on this putting it together, but this is the sort of idea we came up with. So this was quite a nice way of gaining ideas and thinking about connections. So I put the website there, loopy.com. It's quite a really easy to use, and I think quite enjoyable for participants to use as well. And it came up with some ideas that later we use for discussions to possibly fine-tune and add a little bit of depth to what the idea would be in terms of the model. Okay, so yeah, just going back to kind of the approach. So the problem is, as we identified, that most IAMs treat society as a subset of the economy, and this has implications for the way it's approached and also the framing of challenges, because if everything is framed as a technical issue, maybe there is a technical solution, you just flick a switch and everything can be right as rain. If you think of society as a wider heterogeneous aspect within the model, then it gives you more scope for digging deeper to it. So the challenge was that we want to better represent people, and new uses of data, maybe new forms of data are required, in addition to new approaches to model society. So the idea is a better developed, more realistic and endogenous inclusion of population and society, informed by participatory model to produce a range of futures which address societal changes and needs. And these are some of the main ideas that we're interested in. So aging populations and dependency ratio, they have, of course, massive impacts on society, but also on the economy. Migration, true in terms of the economy, also links to, within the economy in terms of labor, for example, also potential links to human rights and access to resources, etc. Health, in terms of social impacts, but also can influence the economy as well. Then inequality, which Guilherme will talk a bit more, education and well-being. So all of these are important and interesting of themselves, but if and when it's their feedback into the system, they can have knock-on impacts on the economy and the environment, and so the model as a whole. Okay, so just a little bit about population. So population is and has been studied, in fact, since the ancient Greeks, I think. But it was really within the Enlightenment where this sort of study really took off. So I've put a little simple representation of the Malthusian trap. So this is Thomas Malthus' idea that if population grows too quickly, then it will exceed food and the population will collapse. You'll have a famine, etc. These sort of ideas got, I would say, fine-tuned, but not entirely changed through the 60s, the kind of post-World War II development change within the 60s. We have a bit more focus on how can we develop in a fair and just way. Sustainable wasn't the word used then, but I think a lot of the thinking is pretty much the same as what developed within the 90s later. And the idea of I equals PAT. So we had the population bomb and limits to growth, and this idea that population needs to be controlled. And also, when the coining of the term sustainable development came in 1992, this is from Agenda 21, Rio, and quite an interesting idea. To achieve sustainable development and a higher quality of life for all people, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. Okay, I think we're all okay with that. And promote appropriate demographic policies. So actually extremely controversial, this, because there's a lot of judgment on what is appropriate. If you talk as a particular type of scientist, you would say that it would be appropriate to, of course, slow down fertility rates, because then we avoid this point of crisis that's in the diagram. Of course, it's not as simple as this, and it has social and cultural implications. But also, population. I'm not to say that population is not a problem, and we can just have a little bit of relativism and everything's fine, because of planetary boundaries give us the thresholds through which our impact does affect on the environment. So population is not going away as an issue. It's been an issue for hundreds, thousands of years, and it's important to get a better understanding of numbers because of the impact it has. However, as I mentioned previously, we need to move from population to demography to get a more rounded, more useful picture. And I suppose perhaps less judgmental, less dangerous as well, because population can be used and abused for political reasons. So if we think about demography, there are three main demographic events: births, deaths, and migration. So it's actually quite simple. There are other demographic events, but if you're doing a crude analysis, then these are the ones that you need to think about. So in terms of births, we think about fertility rates, and of course they vary by age, and the gender ratio, because in fact this doesn't ever really change, but the amount of fertile, fecund women conditions the amount of births, of course. Then we need to look at deaths, which is related to life expectancy, but that's a function of remaining years of life and life expectancy at birth. And of course, this relates to mortality as well. and then migration. So migration balance, which is essentially just people who are moving into an area, moving out of an area. Used to be called immigration, emigration. Now it's normally just called in migration and out migration. And in order to get this data, most of it is through UN stats, or I think a lot of the United Nations stats are hosted on various platforms, but essentially they're managed by UN stats. Some of them are available on FAO, for example. FAO has wonderful stats for environmental food data as well. And yes, this gives us population by age, sex, place, and household size. So just some ideas about the importance of the indicators. So life expectancy, fertility, and net migration. I've just put some kind of economic and environmental conditions. Maybe conditions isn't the right word. Economic links, we could say. So, for example, with life expectancy, there's links between GDP and Gini, and with environmental conditions, disasters, and climate change. Of course, nowadays there's studies about climate change impacting on mortality more generally, heat waves, for example. Then fertility, generally, it's inversely related to GDP and Gini, and inversely related to education and gender equality. Of course, these are kind of complex social processes. So it's also true that education and gender equality are related to certain religious practices, for example. So it's a little bit A, complicated, and B, perhaps unrealistic to just flick a switch and change that, but I think it's also possible. And in the environmental conditions, I read an article this morning, actually, about this idea. So reduced size of family in the global north, but I think the article was talking about reduced size of family in Ethiopia, perhaps. So, of course, lots of things are going on in Ethiopia at the moment. However, it's true that people are thinking about climate change, and it is the case now that environmental conditions are impacting all sorts of decisions rather than just economic conditions. Of course, environmental and economic link together intrinsically in most areas also. Then just in terms of net migration, we have migration hump theory. So this is that basically poor people don't move. So what the media tell you that you get millions of poor people moving from the south to the north. So from Africa to Europe, from Latin America to the USA. It's not the poor who move, actually. It's the people who are somehow in the middle. I think middle class isn't the right term, but somehow in the middle. The rich maybe don't need to move, so they don't move. So those who move is in the Goldilocks zone. And then in terms of environmental conditions, environmental degradation can trigger displacement, migration, but only if they have the resources to move. And these movements tend to be shorter as well. Don't necessarily move intercontinentally or inter-region within the model because of climate change. So in terms of the demographic model, so this is basic representation. So I'm not going to go into very much detail, just highlight a few. As I said, I'm not a modeler, I'll highlight a few ideas. So here we have just fertility rates. So you'll see the United Nations data at the top. Most of this comes from United Nations. So the gender ratio and fertility rates, and this gives us the births and regions per sex, and this feeds into population. Then this life expectancy at birth, mortality, a little bit more complicated. I think it's not intrinsically more complicated. It's more that with fertility, we haven't yet modeled if and how fertility changes, as I mentioned, with social, cultural, economic, educational change, but it's possible. So within mortality, so we have equations which are related to, I suppose, development. We call them development, yeah, some sort of change within society. So we have at the bottom greenhouse gas emissions, annual government expenditure on health, and average schooling time. This feeds into life expectancy, and this is something we developed quite recently as probably the three main documented peer-reviewed factors that can feed into life expectancy. And anyway, this can feed into life expectancy at birth and into mortality more generally. You can see at the top that we have a policy scenario that will also feed into this, because depending on, I think you've had a little bit on the different scenarios and pathways that we're looking at, but within certain ones, which I'll talk about a little bit later, we have slightly higher life expectancy, for example. And then in terms of migration, so as I mentioned, it's essentially annual in-migration and out-migration. And this is by regions, sex, and ages. And it's important to have this data on sex and ages, because therefore we have this knock-on impact on society, the economy, and even use of resources as well. And so you can see there's the switch migration here, which will enable us to turn on and off migration. So here's just a very, I think, simple result. But when I say simple, I think that's okay, because this is connecting to other aspects within the model. So this is just world population, and we are modeling slightly different changes in fertility, and you can see, but by the end, by 2050, there's a range of what is there, like 3 billion difference. So of course that has huge implications for what happens with the rest of the transition and within the module as well. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit, excuse me, a little bit about society now. Okay, so the Sustainable Development Goals are set up to give all countries, so it's not just developing countries, in reality, of course, it is mainly developing countries, a framework for what they can and should do in order to develop in a holistic manner by 2030. And so I looked at the SDG report for 2023, and it says that we're seriously off track. Okay, I think this was known within a couple of years that this wasn't going to happen. And of course, some of this can be ascribed to COVID, but not all of it. But anyway, so the Sustainable Development Goals are a massive improvement on the Millennium Development Goals for two main reasons. Number one is they're much more integrated. There are synergies within a lot of them. And number two, they have a much better focus on the environment and climate. The Millennium Development Goals were a bit of a disaster in that context. Nothing could be agreed, and also the science wasn't really available at that point. Anyway, so we can see that this is one way of dividing them up. The 5 Ps: planet, people, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. Within people, we have no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, and gender equality. I think you could certainly say that affordable and clean energy could, number 7, could also be under people, and 10, reduced inequalities. I mean, when you're combining people and prosperity, I think, there's so many overlaps. Anyway, so you can see on the graph that this is what needs to happen, this rather optimistic hockey stick, we could say, nearly. But it's not going to happen because we're progressing slowly. However, this is one of the ideas of models such as WILIAM, is that we can see how these sort of things can be attained. And one way that we can do this is through indices which track development. So we've got the Human Development Index, for example, and this is the most common way of tracking development. And it's basically a combination of health, education, and money. And they are, I think, what they do within those three domains is not bad, actually. So in terms of health, we're looking at life expectancy at birth and life expectancy index. So there's not so much about being healthy, it's more about being long. And then we're looking at education, the amount of schooling and education that people are actually receiving, and then a decent standard of living, looking at Gini. I mean, it's not the best way, but not the worst way of looking at these things. However, HDI doesn't think about demands placed on the earth. Okay, there's nothing environmental here. It's all social. So it's therefore not in line with ideas of sustainable development, which have been around for a few decades now, and especially not in line with the SDGs, which makes it a little bit simplistic, let's say, and maybe not so useful for tracking development as is understood nowadays. And it, in fact, therefore leads to exceeding planetary boundaries. So here's a couple of plots. This comes from the Sustainable Development Index website, which is a really nice website for explaining SDI. So basically, you can see the correlation on the left between HDI and CO2 emissions and HDI and material footprint. So essentially, as countries become more successful under HDI, they are also producing more pollution and demanding more on the earth. So the Sustainable Development Index builds on HDI, but as an environmental component. So when we're doing a review at the start of the project, we thought this was an excellent idea to increase. And as we have the elements or proxies thereof of all of this, it is possible. So the Sustainable Development Index is the HDI, but with the Ecological Impact Index. So this is, I think it shows the potential of WILIAM. So once an index is produced, and if and when it's endogenous, then we can add on more, developing more elements to the model, more indices, and you can create an exact index, ideally, because that's better for sharing and policy. And if we think back to the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., we want to be trying to do something that can be measured across regions, countries, or combined with proxies if that's the best that we can do. So we have CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases. Material footprints a little bit more complicated, but the same sort of idea can be applied. So this is quite an interesting one. So on the left, we have HDI. On the right, we have SDI. So in both of these, so the scale's missing on the left, but it's the same idea. Green is good, red is bad. So in terms of HDI, you can see that North America, Europe, Australia are doing really well. But if you essentially invert it by looking at SDI, you can see that the same regions are not doing so well. Okay, so it's a valuable tool for tracking, I would say, more realistic development goals. Okay, so just in terms of the society module, again, this is more of a work in progress, actually. So demographies, populations endogenized, most of the ideas are in place. Society is a work in progress. However, I'll talk a little bit about a couple of things. So education is quite a nice idea to bring in. If we've just had Iñaki talking a little bit about the economy So it's really central for understanding how the economy will interact, but also B, coming into HDI, etc. So we've got percentage of workforce per region, average schooling time, and school life expectancy. Then we have, this can feed into the HDI. So life expectancy at birth, knowledge index, and living standard index, which is essentially related to GDP. And there's the Gini there. I'm not going to talk more about inequality because we're going to discuss that later. And here's some partial results related to, I think it's maybe a combination of demography and society in terms of the household composition. So within 2015 on the left, we have the way that this is the sort of households that people live in. And we can see that there is, compared to what we think in 2050, essentially there'll be an increase in more people living alone. So this is related to sort of current trends. And why is this important? I suppose it has social and cultural issues, but in terms of energy use and buildings, etc. So this is the sort of thing that we can get from the models about how quite difficult to come up with how to model this, but it gives policymakers an idea of what will be demanded in the future in terms of, for example, energy and building materials, etc. And then this again for workforce, quite simple in of itself, but with various switches about the education level, this can then feed into the economy module to find out which the supply of the workforce. This sort of thing can also interact with migration as well to see just how many people will be available, and of course this feeds into wages, etc. Okay, so I'm just kind of wrapping up briefly. So I think you've seen this or something similar. So society and demography connect into the economy and the environment, land and water as it's called here. There is much more scope to develop these connections and the feedbacks. For example, with land and water, we have been doing some work on the way that in terms of what is farmed, what is produced, what is consumed, so for food. So we've been looking at what the Lancet Commission has identified as a healthy diet, but also a diet that's in balance with kind of cultural norms and what's possible to remain within planetary boundaries. So in the future, it would be possible to consider this land is used for this purpose to produce this crops. It provides this level of nutrition and or this level of malnutrition. And then it's a bit more of a jump, but then what health impact does this have for society? Or what impact does this have for migration, etc. So there's still a lot to do on this, but this is where society and demography are positioned and the opportunities for more. So yeah, this just kind of feeds into what I've just been saying. So work is ongoing. Until now, we have this nice endogenous population, feeds back into the rest of the model, and therefore drives the economy, conditions the economy, maybe it's better, and the demands placed upon the environment. If and when we model fertility, as I mentioned, it's a bit difficult. We could really try and come back to this population issue, get a better idea of how it will be evolving in the future, and therefore what impact does that have on society more generally. And then we can do more on health. And the idea of all of this, kind of going back to what we're trying to do within the United Nations University and with the Sustainable Development Goals. So at the moment, we have this stunted Sustainable Development Goals attainment. Unsustainable, I put a question mark, population growth. Difficult question, but in certain instances, yes, population growth is unsustainable, I would say. And then we have relatively high mortality and fertility in, say, the global south. Of course, in the global north, fertility levels are fairly low, and this can also be an issue to address. And then we have loss and damage from climate change. So we had this brief mention of damage functions or an idea of impacts on sectors that Paola's providing, for example. Within the policy arena, this is called loss and damage from climate change. And we have, of course, inequality and displacement. And you could say under business as usual or green growth, which is the track that most region societies are on, this could well get worse. And if and when we learn a bit more from these models, so I have a colleague who says, you know, all models aren't really very good, but if they're better than a 50%, if they're better than flipping a coin for a decision maker or a policy maker, then they're doing something. So if we can contribute to this, we can contribute to improving some of these problems. So, and of course, from a kind of higher level, this comes from a different process of sustainable development, i.e. Green Deal or post-growth, which I won't go into detail here, but this leads us more to sustainable development goals attainment. Being realistic, that's not going to happen because the sustainable development goals are from 2015 to 2030. We're already halfway through. But it's important, this model goes on beyond this time, and it's important that there's a plan is put in place, of course, under the United Nations for what on earth are we going to do after 2030 to make these happen. So then we have steady population growth or just a steady population, a declining population, reduced mortality and fertility, but of course it might be increased fertility in some circumstances. So adaptation to climate change as opposed to loss and damage. And equality within, of course, gender, intergenerational, probably the big one in terms of climate justice, for example, within countries, within regions, etc. And the ability to choose where to live in dignity as opposed to displacement. Thank you. So I don't know if we're doing questions or we're going straight into Guilherme.
Yes. Thank you very much, Robert, for the very good presentation. Very interesting. We have a few questions in the chat, so you may want to have a look, questions and comments. And then if someone still has another question, you can feel free to raise your hand or leave something in the chat while Robert answers.
Then we have another point. Regionality would be important to consider when assessing a safe and just transition within and between countries. As a global model, does William consider global justice from the perspective of this module? It's a good question. It's something that we have considered, and yes, what we originally wanted to do and still can do is to look at different pathways for the different regions, because to be more realistic, so for example, India isn't going to phase out coal. It's not going to it's going to sort of slowly phase out coal as opposed to stop using coal. So what this means is for India and for the world in general, there's going to be a slightly different future to what we hoped for 2 or 3 years ago. But essentially, the beauty of the regional approach is that different regions can follow different policies, and these can be, you know, the model can be adapted to make different regions do different things, and this will have different impacts. So therefore, it could be that we could have climate justice or global justice or different levels of equality in different regions. This is realistic, and this is something that William is able to do. So maybe I can ask again, if in this module, life expectancy, fertility of migration are affected by pandemics, health issues caused by climate change. Right, so we tried to do this in terms of life expectancy. Linking it to climate change is important but difficult, so it's a work in progress because there's so many ways that it can impact. Impact's probably quite small actually. So in terms of and as you say, even in terms of fertility, that's possible. In terms of pandemics, as a group, we made a little exercise on pandemics. I think, I don't know, maybe someone else can talk to that. But in the end, the idea was it was a bit too problematic to include, because once you put a pandemic in, if you roll a dice and the pandemic comes, boom, everything goes crazy. But health issues caused by climate change, yes, is something that also needs to be worked upon. So, for example, linking climate change and migration, this is a work in progress, but also difficult because of the level of granularity in, say, water within the module, within the model. However, in terms of impacts on sectors, it is possible to do, but it's a bit difficult with migration because it's a kind of very individual level decision. So what we can have is a risk of displacement, a risk of migration due to climate change. It's probably the more realistic way, but I know that maybe for a model or policymaker, they want some hard data, but it's a challenge, I would say. HDI assumes more income means more development. In other words, more income and longer lives, more consumption, more environmental problems. Yeah, this is true, and this is why SDI or similar is, yeah, more realistic, better. I think HDI probably isn't going away, but it's nice to have it in concert with other forms of yeah, I think not a very usable measure for all countries, but also yeah, it's rather dominated by the actual function is dominated. So you always have Scandinavian countries coming first and second. Okay, I have a generic question for both the economy and society modules. How would you integrate unpaid work, voluntary work, and non-lucrative production in your model, especially for post-growth, degrowth scenarios where less goods and services are commodified or produced in market institutions? I'm going to confess, I don't know, and I don't know if Iñaki's still there or Nico would want
yes,
to.
I'm here.
Sure.
We don't have non-paid work in the model. Indeed, this is something that we were thinking for the follow-up version of William.
Okay, great. Well, and voluntary as well, or is it possible to?
We don't have that now.
Okay, but yeah, these sort of things are essential if and when we're looking at.
Indeed, what we were thinking is to add a module for modeling the use of time of people, and that would include both paid and unpaid work, care, etc.
Okay, cool. I'm curious to know if you think cultural differences and choices in terms of lifestyles, more traditional ways, indigenous peoples, voluntary simplicity, neo-rurals can be modeled and linked to economy, more or less informal economy consumption outside the market, and the role of anthropology in these types of influences. Wow. Yeah, we had these sort of discussions about, for example, how do you model indigenous food, like subsistence agriculture? How do you model that? And so I wasn't involved in this, but for example, so through the environment module, I think in the end it's kind of difficult to model. I don't know if we actually were able to do so. But then maybe Iñaki, again, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, indeed. For example, as I already mentioned, for the European Union, we have already 60 household types, but it eventually could be expanded to other household types. Now we are covering 3 dimensions that are income, rural and urban households, and also the composition, single with children, etc. But eventually could be split into more households. So if someone is interested in splitting the household in whatever country in order to differentiate between indigenous people, etc., from the economic part will be possible, and eventually that also should be included in the household module, in the household composition module, because it is pretty much related. So in the household consumption module, I'm going to switch on my camera. In the household consumption module, what we can model is how the household behave, and we can differentiate between different households. And if you want to include indigenous people, that's great. But on the other hand, we have to take from the demographic module the number of households of each type. So you should model in both modules. In the demographic module, the people that how evolved this type of household that you want to add to the model, and in the consumption module, how this new household behave in terms of consumption and what income do they receive, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's I think it's important to say that until now there has been more of a focus, of course, on the EU. It's an EU project and data is available. So if and when there's more resources or access to data, this sort of thing would work at a global scale to answer those sort of questions, I think.
Thank you, Robert. So if there are no other questions, I think we are ready to move on, right? So I'll briefly talk about inequality and the Gini measure, Gini of the income levels in the WILIAM model. So as we know, I mean, we have been talking a lot about sustainability, development, any other targets, but inequality is also a very relevant issue these days. And actually many empirical works, historical works have been showing that inequality is rising, especially in advanced economies, but also in developing regions like India and China in the last decade. So many advanced economies, there was a fall of inequality in the post-war, but then since the 80s, the inequality rates are increasing. So in this graph, we have the top decile share of total income. So the income of the top 10% with respect to the total income. And we have other measures like the Gini index that also show an increase in inequality, but in more slow pace. And then the coefficient, most people know, it's a measure of inequality that compares the one second. Compares the income of each participant of a society with the average. And so this is a global representation of the Gini in the world. So of course, we know Latin American regions tend to be more unequal, the South of Africa, Europe and Canada, more lower levels of inequality as measured by income. And then we also have other measures that look at wealth inequality, and wealth tend to be much more concentrated than income. So I'm not able to, okay. And we have an increasing wealth to income ratios also observed in the recent period. So there is an accumulation of wealth that's more than proportional to the increase in the GDP in many countries, which means also that, as we know, that wealth is concentrated in fewer hands, is much more concentrated than income. This also boosts inequality in the future because wealthy people, they will earn income on the wealth. And so it can increase inequality, and it's also a good argument for us considering strongly the case of a wealth tax as Iñaki was exposing before. So how this appears in WILIAM? So to have inequality, we need to have different households, right? So we cannot have inequality if we are modeling, for instance, with a representative agent or a representative household. So WILIAM has actually a rich description of the household typologies in most of EU countries. So we have a limitation in terms of data, which I'm going to talk to you about later. And of course, since to our knowledge, this makes of WILIAM one of the existing IAMs with the highest level of household heterogeneity. And this is a feature that's critical for capturing the complex interrelationship between climate change and income inequality. So also building on what Iñaki said, you have different income groups, you have different types of households, and they tend to consume, they tend to have different behaviors in terms of energy consumption or consumption of goods and services. And this means that each group of households will have a different material and energy footprint, leading to different results in terms of CO2 emissions and therefore of climate change. So these interrelationships, they appear in somehow in WILIAM, and they are bring very interesting results for us to discuss, because we want to have policies that deal with the emissions, but also do not increase inequality or do not create other problems in this society part. So how is that done? How is that achieved? So there was a great work in terms of connecting databases using micro and macro variables and including them in the models. So these are the countries for which the household disaggregation is available. So there are 21 European countries. For the other countries, unfortunately, due to the lack of data, there is not this detailment, at least not yet. And these are the data sources, the main data sources that are used in this household module to describe the different types of households. So we rely on the household budget survey, which brings data on consumption expenditure on goods and services, physical units, according to a COICA classification that's also after connected to the input-output through a bridge matrix. Then we have the EU SILC, the Statistics on Income and Living Conditions, which brings us a multidimensional cross-sectional data source on household income, transfers, taxes, poverty, exclusion, and living conditions. So this allows us to have an idea on the different quintiles and how the income is appropriate by different household groups. Also household finance and consumption service that provides information on economic behavior, financial situation. And all these micro data, so to say, are connected to the more macro income and data information, and also in consumption that comes from national accounts and from the, more broadly speaking, the European system of account. So we connect the micro data they must be consistent with the macro data we are using the model on income, consumption, and wealth. Also important to say, as Iñaki was hinting before, we have many different types of households. So when I say 60 types of households, we are talking about a variety in terms of urban and rural areas. So they are considered households living in dense or sparse population areas. So they can vary according to whether they are single with children, they are a couple with children, other type with children. And then they also vary according to the quintile of income distribution that they belong. So the first, second, third, and fourth, and fifth quintile. So by connecting all these changes, we get 60 different types. And of course, we have an average of the population by each type of household that comes also from the service. And then we connect the demographic part with the distribution of households. And we also connect the other part, the economic part, the income distribution with the households. Then Another interesting thing is that we can calculate the Gini in the WILIAM model. So to do that, there are different ways to compute in the Gini. So we use this way in which we use the Lorentz curve, right? The curve of income distribution that compares cumulative share of people from lowest to highest incomes to cumulative share of income earned. And then the Gini index is defined as the ratio between the area under the curve and the total area. So by line of equality, we would have what would be the income distribution if every household had the same income level, if everybody got the average level of income. The Lorentz curve would be this straight line here. Since there is inequality, the Lorentz curve tends to have a different shape, and the distance between these two define the degree of income inequality. So basically, these images come from Wikipedia, but basically we organize our households, we order them according to their income share, and we arrange them in this way, and we are able to compute the area below the Lorentz curve based on the values that we have for the share of population and the share of income earned by them. So we are able to have the value of this area below, and then we get to compute Gini, of course, the area below this line, which is the area equivalent to A plus B, is actually 1/2 if we have 100%. If we have percentage shares, which means we can calculate the Gini with this formula that we have in the end, in the right hand right here. So just to show how this works in Gini, in WILIAM, actually opening the formula, opening these variables, you can get some very complex formulas, but this is how it looks like. So we have number of households by income and type. So number of households in each of the 60 groups. Then we calculate the shares of each household group in the total shares. We have households' disposable income that comes from the economic module. And we also calculate the shares of each group. We are able to order, which is necessary to get the Lorentz curve, right? We had to order from the lowest to the highest income earned. And therefore, we can rearrange our sample. And finally, we get to compute the Gini index for each region in the model. So of course, considering only the regions that we have the household disaggregation, so only the 21 countries of Europe that we were able to do this. And this is the result that comes from the baseline scenario of the model currently. So if we just compute the Gini index for these countries, we get a line of this. So of course, as Iñaki was saying, this is still a work in progress, but this is more or less what we get now. And then, I wanted to conclude just saying a few words about basic income, but I think Iñaki did a very good exposition on that. But the main point was to make clear that there are these differences between the impact that a basic income can have in inequality. So these are again preliminary results. So we had the wealth tax and the basic income policy reducing a lot the Gini index among many countries. So all of them had a decrease in Gini. But then there is the trade-off in the side of emissions. And then I'm not showing you here the CO2, the carbon tax scenario, only the wealth tax. And in this case, the emissions tend to increase in all countries at a slight amount at least. So of course, what can be good for bringing more equality might be problematic for the environment, and this is why it's so important to have these two features in the model and be able to work with them together. So thank you very much.